Hey everyone, my name is Bradley and this is part 3 of my commentary/review of Gargoyles Season 2. This time, we're going to be looking at most of the world tour, starting with monsters and going up through Sentinel. I'm going to be going into spoilers as usual, so be warned that if you have not watched these episodes, then you might not get much out of this video. With that said, let's get started. We're going to start off by looking at monsters first. This is where Goliath and the others return to Scotland and run into Sevarius at Loch Ness. It's also where we learn that Angela is the biological daughter of Goliath. I'm actually going to start off by listing my complaints first, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. So, one of my main complaints with this episode is Sevarius himself. I found him entertaining in his previous episodes, such as Double Jeopardy or The Cage, but here his portrayal felt a bit messy. To me, he came across as boringly evil, for starters. He even says that his goal is to create monsters, which is why he's after the genetic material of Nessie and Big Daddy in the first place. A crazed geneticist who says that he wants to specifically create monsters is hard for me to see as anything but a simple-minded evil villain. Sevarius even locks the heroes up in a literal dungeon at one point. Compare his behavior here to his behavior back in The Cage. In that episode, there was a feeling of regret coming from Sevarius. He wanted to conceal his past mistakes rather than repair them. He was a chaotic villain, but he still demonstrated some humanity. He had a believable motivation in that episode. Here in Monsters, however, I found him to be a cliché evil villain for the previously mentioned reasons. I'm fairly confident that if Sevarius had a mustache, he would twirl it with his finger at least once in this episode. I think that simple-minded bad guy villains can be used effectively, such as in Deadly Force, but in this episode, I don't think that Sevarius' inclusion does much for his character or the episode's theme. One of the main themes of this episode is, of course, monsters. Sevarius wants to capture and use the Loch Ness monsters, but the idea is that Sevarius is actually more of a monster than Nessie or Big Daddy. But that's not really a new concept to anyone who saw how nasty Sevarius was in Metamorphosis or The Cage. And in regards to Nessie and Big Daddy, the idea that they are not monsters at all, despite their fearsome appearances, has already been done before, and done better. Goliath and the other gargoyles look like monsters, but the reality is that they are friendly and caring. I think that the gargoyles were better used to establish that idea than the Loch Ness monsters were, because we can see the gargoyles as people. They talk like us, they walk like us, they socialize like us, and so forth. We were able to relate to the gargoyles personally, so the idea that one's outward appearance does not represent one's inner self worked well. This has been a key concept of the series ever since the very first episode. So in terms of themes, I don't think that this episode is doing anything new or noteworthy. Next, I would have liked to have seen Goliath's reaction to the reveal that Angela is his daughter. Partway through the episode, Sevarius tells Goliath that it's too late for fatherly concern, but we never actually see Goliath's initial response to the fact that he's Angela's father. That's a pretty significant life event for anyone, more so for Goliath, given that gargoyles are rather few in numbers. I would have liked to have seen the part where Angela explains to Goliath that she is his daughter, because it's an important occasion for both of the characters. However, the closest we get is a scene at the end where Angela says that she liked when the family got back together, and Goliath simply responds, "Me too." I feel like the episode missed an opportunity by not showing how Goliath reacted to this important revelation. Lastly, I think that the animation in this episode could have been better. The shading here is pretty jumpy. For instance, the part just before Goliath and Elisa board the sub in the third act comes to mind, as well as the part where Sevarius reveals Angela's parentage to her. Of course, I can't show inconsistent shading through screenshots, so you'll have to check that out on your own. The character's facial features also shift around unnaturally at times. For instance, Sevarius' eyes would oftentimes move towards and away from each other when he talked, as though the very eye sockets in his skull were rearranging themselves. It doesn't look very believable, and I found it distracting. So you might be wondering why I started this review by stating the negatives rather than the positives. I'll explain that in a second, but as a note, one thing that I've been trying to do ever since I looked back at my Season 1 video is try to be more broad while discussing an episode's pros and cons. For instance, using temptation as an example, I think it would have been more helpful for me to have said something like, Brooklyn's character was well established throughout the episode, and then proceed to give specific instances that support that claim, rather than simply say, the motorcycle scene established Brooklyn's character. One thing I've been trying to do is examine the episode's consistent strengths and weaknesses in the episode as a whole, rather than saying, well, this one scene was good. So in regards to any positive elements of monsters, I can't think of any major things that I thought it did consistently well throughout the whole episode. But that does not mean that I liked nothing at all about it. It just means that I don't think, on a macro scale, monsters excelled in any particular areas. Still, there were occasional isolated moments that I enjoyed. I laughed out loud at the part where Sevarius says, "If it gets any more saccharine in there, I'm going to put a finger down my throat." And I like the part where Goliath and Elisa are in the sub, and Elisa asks the soldier to zoom the camera in, to which he replies, "Why not? There's nothing you can do about it." He's got a point, or so he understandably thinks. And I think that's a clever little detail. But those are just individual lines, not major plot points or recurring elements of the episode. So that's why I wanted to list the negatives first for this particular episode. It seemed kind of silly of me to start off the review with just a couple of positive tidbits, without having established some macro-level negative points to juxtapose them with. Overall, I'm not really a fan of this episode. I thought that this was Sevarius' weakest episode yet, and I don't like how the episode glossed over a major life event for Goliath and Angela. The theme of what monsters truly are is nothing new to the series, and I think it could have been handled better here. I don't like starting off this video with an episode that I dislike, but that's just how Season 2 happened to be divided up. So anyways, let's move on. Next up is Golem, which takes place in Prague. This episode brings back Renard and Vogel, who we first saw in Outfoxed. First of all, I think the theme of this episode is interesting. When we first met Renard, the writers made it clear that he was all about integrity and honesty. And we sort of see a continuation of that here at the beginning of Golem, when it's shown that Renard ended up forgiving Vogel after the events of Outfoxed. But Renard is usually a very honorable character. But now that his life is at risk, he's driven to do things that he would never have done in the past. And that's the main message of the episode. The reality that he might not live much longer causes him to hire a gangster to steal an artifact that will prolong his life. It's a lot like Xanatos in The Price, except here Renard is more pressed for time. He probably doesn't have much time before his body gives up on him, so there's a real sense of urgency driving his dubious actions. Renard and Xanatos are usually polar opposites, but what this episode is trying to say is that the inevitableness of death can cause two opposite people to act the same way. Using Renard of all people to explore this concept was a smart move, I think, because he was previously established as a very moral character. So seeing that even the honorable Renard will resort to underhanded methods to avoid death demonstrates that death truly brings everyone to equal ground. I think that's a surprisingly harrowing theme to put in any TV show. So I think that the message of this episode was established well for the most part. There's also some nice animation to be seen here. I like the look of the golem as well as the scenery. I think that the episode has a nice, quiet atmosphere that would be hard to convey in an episode that took place in New York. I wouldn't say that this is the most visually stunning episode in the series, but it usually looks good, and I think it draws you into the world of the show. While I found Renard's motivations in this episode intriguing, I thought that his corruption when he became the golem was a bit awkward. He initially steals the golem with the sole objective of saving his own life. He has no malicious intentions outside of this. Yet, when he becomes the golem, he starts marching through Prague like a monster. He starts crushing cars and terrifying people, and turning streetlights into pretzels, all while laughing like a straight-up evil villain. His corruption as a result of his new power felt way too sudden to me. Maybe if he became the golem earlier on in the episode, his corruption would have been able to grow more naturally. Renard tries to justify his actions by saying that he has no choice, which I guess implies that the golem itself has a will of its own, and he's struggling to control it. But I think that goes against what we were told about the golem earlier in the episode. The flashback of the golem protecting Prague shows that the golem knows one purpose in life: to protect Prague. Its goal is not to protect itself by getting rid of any counterspells there might be. So when Renard says that his actions are not his fault, I think that the episode is either contradicting itself, or Renard is knowingly refusing responsibility. Perhaps this could be circumvented by showing the golem having a mind of its own during the Rabbi Lowe flashback. But as the episode currently stands, I think that either Renard should have become the golem earlier, so that his corruption would feel less rushed, or the golem's apparent desire to protect itself should have been established in the flashback. Next, I think that the episode should have demonstrated Brode a bit more. Max needs to reawaken the golem in order to stop Brode, but we don't see Brode do much aside from steal the golem, which wasn't even his own idea. Compare him to Dracon from earlier episodes in the show. I've already spoken of how I don't find Dracon an interesting character, but at least we see him causing explosions, or hijacking an arms shipment, or organizing a protection racket. When we see him blowing up buildings, for example, right from that moment we want Drakon to be stopped. Here in Golem, we're told that Brode is the villain before we see him actually do anything villainous. To be fair, the episode starts off by showing Brode being chased by the police, but we don't know what he did to get into that situation. We don't really get to establish Brode as a bad guy on our own, so his setup was not very satisfying to me. Max and Janus talk about how Brode has the city of Prague in the palm of his hand, but we don't really see Brode do much to make us dislike him. Overall, I feel pretty neutral towards Golem. It's fun at times, but it's also got some things that I think hold it back. I think it's a fairly easy episode to go back to. I mean, as I said before, the quiet atmosphere is nice, and I like hearing the story of the Golem itself. And I think that the message is set up well, but once Renard becomes the Golem, things get a bit sloppy. So I think that this episode could be better, but it could also be a lot worse than it currently is. The next stop on the world tour is Paris. Here in Sanctuary, we're going to catch up with Demona, Macbeth, and Thalog. My favorite part of this episode is Thalog himself. In my review of Double Jeopardy, I said that while Thalog is one of the show's few villains that is purely chaotic, I still find him a fun character because of his over-the-top personality, as well as how he manipulates other characters to accomplish his own goals. That's exactly what Thalog does here in Sanctuary. There's a great part when Macbeth is locked up behind bars, and Thalog slips him a laser gun without letting Demona know. Macbeth of course escapes, but Thalog plays dumb. He's pushing Demona and Macbeth around like chess pieces in order to get what he wants. That's another thing that I love about Thalog. He doesn't sit around in some lair, stroking his cat and drinking a martini. Instead, he actively works to achieve his goals. Thalog makes things happen, rather than waiting for things to happen. I think that's one reason why he's such a great character. But anyways, to recap, here's what's going on at this point in the episode. Macbeth thinks that Dominique loves him, when the reality is that she doesn't love him at all, because she's, of course, Demona. Now, Demona thinks that Thalog loves her, when the reality is that he's trying to get her killed. She doesn't even consider the possibility that her love Thalog might be working against her. Both Demona and Macbeth are unknowingly being used by the people they love. It's an effective demonstration of how love can be blinding, which is one of the episode's major themes. Thankfully, Elisa recognizes what's going on, and eventually she works to stop Demona and Macbeth from fighting, because she knows that if Thalog gets all the money, he could potentially be unstoppable. I think that's awesome because it means that Thalog has sort of put Elisa, Goliath, Demona, and Macbeth all on the same side. It's sort of like how in City of Stone, Demona's actions made Xanatos and Goliath form an alliance, even though Xanatos and Goliath are enemies of each other. So I think that this is one of the best episodes for Thalog. I like him for the same reason I like Matt. He's a great character not necessarily because of his own development, but rather the way he affects the other characters in the story. Angela gets some good moments here as well. This is where she learns that Demona is her mother, which is a fact that Goliath had been trying to conceal. There's a short but intriguing scene at the end of the episode where Demona wakes up in front of Angela and then leaves with Thalog. Now, take a second to consider what's going through Angela's head here. In the few encounters they've had together, Angela has seen Demona do some pretty terrible things. So it's understandable that Angela would feel conflicted about Demona. That being said, Angela still witnesses her own mother leave with Thalog, who Angela knows tried to orchestrate Demona's death. Angela has good reasons to fear Demona, but that doesn't change the fact that she wants to get to know her. It's a relatively quick moment, but it effectively complicates Angela's character in a good way. Angela's connection to her mother and father is one of my favorite parts of the latter half of the season, because it adds suspense in a way that is believable and, for lack of a better term, human. As I said at the end of my previous video, oftentimes TV shows will add in new regular characters, with the goal being to expand the world of the series. And if you're wanting to add a regular character to your TV show, take notes from Angela. She gets meaningful character development, like here in Sanctuary, but she does not hog the show. In addition to being a well-written character in her own right, she illuminates a previously unseen side of characters like Goliath and Demona, among others. The purpose of Angela's character is not to serve as a distraction, but rather to build the world of the series, and I think that she does that effectively. I guess my main complaint with Sanctuary is the animation. It's nowhere near as bad as the animation from Monsters a few episodes back, and there are actually some decent moments here and there in this episode, but I feel like the animation could be cleaned up a bit. I thought that the shading was a bit jumpy at times, for example. It's especially noticeable during close-up shots of characters talking, since the characters only make small movements, but the shading shifts around awkwardly. It was probably the most distracting element of the episode for me. Another thing that bothers me is that Elisa doesn't try to call her parents again after she was interrupted the first time. It's not even implied that she tried calling them again off-screen. And as we see in the upcoming episode, Mark of the Panther, Elisa's parents are surprised to hear from her. So I find it strange that Elisa doesn't try calling her parents again. Overall, I think that Sanctuary is a great episode. Thalog is at his best here. He's got a sick plan and he almost accomplishes it. I like that this episode advances the overarching plot through the introduction of Nightstone Unlimited, the alliance between Demona and Thalog, and Angela learning who her mother is. I've watched this series a couple of times, and Sanctuary remains one of my favorite World Tour episodes. Here we are at M.I.A., which takes place in London. This is where we're going to meet Griff, who appears in the upcoming Pendragon episode, as well as learn of the survival of another Gargoyle clan. So right off the bat, this episode has great looking animation. I really like the shading on the characters' clothes and wings, such as in the first two shots. The shading is oftentimes made up of only two colors, yet the character models have a tangible sense of three-dimensional shape. Like, the characters don't look like flat drawings, if that makes sense. The airplane sequences also look really good here. The planes fly across the screen quickly, but they still have a high level of detail. For example, compare the look of the airplanes in this episode to the look of the airplane in Metamorphosis. There are also several little details here that make the animation pop, such as the nuanced movement of Griff's hair, or at the end of the episode, when Leo sees Griff for the first time in years, you can see the corners of Leo's mouth raised slightly as he walks forward. There's a great attention to detail showcased from start to finish. Overall, I think there's a lot to like about the animation in this episode. I like seeing the London clan's way of life and their personalities in comparison to that of the Manhattan clans. Back in New York, the Gargoyles live in hiding inside the clock tower. They tend to only interact with humans when there's a problem, like when they need to deal with Xanatos' shenanigans, or Macbeth's, or back in City of Stone there was like that terrorist that they had to stop. But most of the time, they try to keep their distance from the humans. In London, the Gargoyles are sort of the opposite. They run a shop when they're awake at night, so they are constantly interacting with people. But unlike the Manhattan clan, Una and Leo are not interested in protecting the city. There's even a part where I think Una says that what goes on outside the shop is none of our business. Griff is of course the exception to this mindset. Like, he wants to get out and protect London from the Nazis, and that's why he and Goliath quickly become friends. But Una and Leo, they don't see their city as their protectorate, unlike the Manhattan Gargoyles. And at the end of the episode, they have this great character moment where they wonder if Griff's supposed death was actually their own fault, because they decided to sit around instead of facing the threat of the Nazis. In a way, Una and Leo learn the same lesson that Brooklyn learned back in Kingdom. In that episode, Brooklyn came to learn that sometimes you need to do what's responsible rather than what you are comfortable with. Here in M.I.A., Una and Leo learn that principle as well. So I thought that the London clan was another strong point of the episode, because of their character development and the way they were used to contrast against the Manhattan clan. I also like the way the immutable time stream rule is used here. It makes sense why Leo and Una were able to recognize Goliath in the present, because he had met them in the past decades before. And even though Goliath never changed history, because, well, it can't be changed, Griff's failure to return home in 1940 also still makes sense because Griff never died. I think the time travel plot here is cleverly written because it makes complete logical sense, and that's something that I think is hard to pull off in any time travel story. And I feel like at this point I should comment on something that I said in a previous video. Back in my review of the episode Vows, I said that I did not like the immutable time stream rule. Looking back, I feel like I was making a big generalization there, because I actually quite like how the time stream rule is used in episodes like M.I.A. or Avalon Part 2. I still don't like the way it's used in Vows, because it's used to justify Goliath and Demona making what I consider to be clear mistakes, but my dislike for the time travel in that episode is the exception, rather than the norm. For the most part, I like the way the immutable time stream rule is used in this episode, as well as in the upcoming episode Future Tense, but that's a story for another video. The main problem I had with M.I.A. was probably the beginning. I thought that there were some contrivances that existed just to get the plot into the position it needed to be in order to truly start. For example, I thought it was a bit silly that the humans believed that Una and Leo were actually just people wearing masks. Back in Eye of the Beholder, the humans similarly believed that the Gargoyles were just humans in costumes, but it made more sense in that episode because it took place on Halloween, which is the night you're supposed to be in costume. Here in M.I.A., Una and Leo have been running a store for decades, and everyone is casually going with the idea of them wearing the same masks 24/7. So I thought that was just a little hard to swallow. Also, it seemed a bit extreme when Una and Leo literally imprisoned Goliath's friends, like in chains and everything. I don't think that's something that anyone would believably do in a similar situation. It's like, oh hey, we thought you died decades ago, but now that we think you've been hiding all this time, we're going to hold your friends hostage in our cellar. I think it's just a bit too much. From a storytelling perspective, I understand why the writers had Una and Leo imprison Angela, Elisa, and Bronx. That way Goliath will have a reason to go back in time using the Phoenix Gate, but the setup felt a bit contrived to me. There's also the part where we hear Goliath's inner thought process just before he goes back in time. I think it's the only time in the series that we hear something like that, so it felt a bit out of place. Again, it's sort of a necessary step to get the actual plot rolling, but I wish it had been handled differently. Maybe have Goliath speak out loud so as to maintain consistency with the other episodes, but have him be vague so that Una and Leo don't know what he's talking about. In the end, I really like this episode. It looks great, the characters are fun, the voice acting is good, and I think it's one of the better uses of the World Tour as a world-building device. Next up is Grief, which takes place in Egypt. This is sort of the last episode with the pack working together as a team. One of my favorite parts of this episode is the Emir, who I think is one of the most interesting World Tour characters. His backstory is simple but effective. His son died in a sudden car accident a few years ago, and so he's angry with the god of death. This is the first time we see the Emir, but he's efficiently built up as a sympathetic character, despite us having almost no knowledge of him beforehand. The Emir's motives are understandable because of his backstory, and I think that's what every villain should be, understandable. For example, the reason Demona is a great villain is because in her eyes, her actions are justified. We don't want her to succeed, but we know where her mindset is coming from. So anyways, I love how the Emir's character ties into the theme of the episode. Anubis is explaining that death is the great equalizer. It puts everyone on equal ground, so it would not be fair to make exceptions to the rule. Because of this, we get to see both sides of the issue. We feel sorry for the Emir, but we also understand that it would not be fair for Anubis to play favorites. We don't want the Emir to be defeated. Rather, we want him to see things our way. And that's how his story is resolved. At the end of the episode, the Emir accepts the situation, proving that he has learned his lesson. So in this 20-minute long episode, we are essentially introduced to the Emir. We hear his backstory, we watch him develop, and then we see the conclusion of his story. He's a very efficiently written character. The thing with the World Tour is that each episode only has 20 minutes to introduce new characters and develop them, so their potential is a bit pressured by time. But I think that the Emir is one of the most precisely written characters in the World Tour because of his effective backstory and the way he learns his lesson. Another thing I like about this episode is how dark it is. The themes of this episode include death and why it's necessary, power and how it is intoxicating, and of course grief and how it pushes people to commit dangerous acts fueled by revenge. These are all pretty grim themes for a cartoon to explore, especially in comparison to the themes of, say, Lighthouse or Eye of the Beholder. But I'm glad that the episode does not sugarcoat its themes. This is a dark episode. You've got the Emir, who's trying to control death itself in order to bring back his child that died in a car accident. And then there's Jackal, whose thirst for power is terrifying because of how corrupt it makes him. When we first met him in Thrill of the Hunt, he was just a TV star. But through episodes such as Upgrade and now Grief, we've seen him become less and less human. He started out as pretty much a normal guy, but here he becomes consumed by a desire for power, and he starts destroying entire cities. And lastly, at the end of the episode, the Emir dies when he decides to give up the power of the Avatar. Like, do you see how messed up this episode is? The episode uses moments like these to unapologetically convey its themes, just like Deadly Force did back in Season 1. If this episode sugarcoated these dark elements, the messages of the episode would probably not have been as impactful. On a happier note, the animation here is pretty good. I especially like the lighting, such as in the middle screenshot. I think it captures the feel of the tomb that the episode takes place in. And I also like Avatar Jackal's design. It was a creative visual fusion of Jackal's cybernetic armor and Anubis. And I also like the coyote design here. I just thought it looked cool. So visually, I think that the episode has some creative character designs, and I thought that they were animated well. Something about the episode that bothers me more than it probably should is the dual voices of the avatars. You simultaneously hear Jackal's voice, or the Emir's voice, in tandem with Anubis's voice. This is a cool idea, but the voice tracks rarely line up with each other, and I found it distracting. One part of the episode that I find a bit weird is the fight between the heroes and the pack inside the burial chamber. At this point of the episode, the Emir is holding Anubis captive, so death is not possible. So I'm not sure what to think of this fight scene, because in a way, failure is not a possibility. But then again, maybe it's like you can still mostly die, but you can't go all the way to death. So maybe there is still something at stake here? I'm not sure. I think the episode should have explored those logistics a bit more. In the end, Grief is one of my favorite World Tour episodes. I'm glad that it was not sugar-coated, and I think that the Emir is a great character. The episode has plenty of memorable moments, and my main complaints with it are pretty small. Here we are at the Hound of Ulster, which is set in Ireland. Bronx actually gets to be one of the major characters here, which doesn't happen very often. I suppose I'll talk about the animation first. This is a good-looking episode. I like the animation here for the same reason why I like the animation back in Leader of the Pack at the beginning of the season. Visually, the Hound of Ulster is not as flashy as, say, The Price or, recently, M.I.A., but it's still enjoyable to look at because of the high fidelity between frames. The characters move properly, and there's a good amount of detail that made the world believable. There's some nice scenery, like the screenshot in the middle there. I think the consistent animation makes the episode easy to watch. In regards to the writing, I think that The Hound of Ulster is a pretty unique episode. The reason I say that is because the main focus here is on Rory and the Banshee, two characters we have never met before. Goliath, Angela, and Elisa actually don't get that much screen time here. Bronx, on the other hand, gets to be one of the major players in the plot, which is another unique trait of the episode. Now, Rory is very much the protagonist of this episode, so I want to focus on him. What I love about Rory is that he's introduced as just a normal guy. He's not the chosen one, like Max. He doesn't have to fight a magical trickster like Not Solani. And he's not a former TV star like Dingo. Instead, Rory is initially just some guy who worries about his future. He's unhappy with his life in Ireland, but he doesn't have the money to move out of the country. He's stuck in his current circumstances. What Rory doesn't know is that he's actually the reincarnation of Cú Chulainn, a legendary hero from ancient Ireland, and that his former nemesis, the Banshee, is kind of his girlfriend. That's because the Banshee is trying to prevent Rory from discovering who he really is. She's trying to make him leave Ireland by encouraging him to go to America, for example. And when Rory starts seeing vision of the cairn that he needs to go to, Molly discourages him from going there. The story is all about how Rory learns to discover his true identity by overcoming the Banshee's deception. So, the way I read it, the episode is asking us to consider what our Banshees and Mollies are. It's asking you to consider what things in your life are holding you back from being your best self. I don't know if that's the message the episode was going for, but that's what I got out of it. This is one of the few episodes in the series in which Bronx plays a major role in advancing the plot. Usually Bronx is just a background character, but here he gets a chance to be the deuteragonist. I like that Rory thinks that Bronx is the legendary Hound of Ulster itself. This is a good way to logically incorporate Bronx into a spotlight role, because Rory has an idea of what Bronx might be. By that I mean, if you set this episode in some other nation that did not have a mythological Hound of Legend, the human characters would not know what to think of Bronx, so bringing them together could be awkward from a writing perspective. So I like that the writers used a fitting legend to incorporate Bronx into a major role. While we're on the subject of Bronx, one thing about the episode that slightly bothers me is the fact that Bronx was somehow able to escape the bog, but the others were not. I guess it might have something to do with him being a gargoyle beast. Like Elisa, Goliath, and Angela are all bipedal and have similar anatomies, but Bronx is of course built very differently. So maybe that's why he was the only one who could escape, but I'm not sure. To be honest, I can't think of any major complaints that I have with this episode. That doesn't mean it's like my favorite episode, or that I think it's one of the best episodes in the whole series, but I really don't have any major complaints about it. I seem to remember reading someone online criticizing this episode for not being essential to the overarching plot, aside from foreshadowing the gathering. But I think it's perfectly fine to have a self-contained episode every once in a while. They can be used sort of like an intermission at a play. Having a short intermission is fine and even beneficial. It gives the audience a chance to take a breather and gather their energy for what's next. Of course, if the intermission is so lengthy that things get boring, that's obviously a problem. But I think that taking a short break from the core plot is fine in small doses. So I think it's okay to have a relatively self-contained episode every once in a while, as long as it's entertaining, like the Hound of Ulster. Walkabout is going to focus on Dingo and what he's been up to ever since he left the pack behind. Given that he's the focus of this episode, it's fitting that it takes place in Australia. So Dingo himself is probably my favorite part of this episode. It's nice to see him redeem himself given that he started off as a villain. Whenever a villain does something heroic for a change, like Xanatos did in City of Stone, I think it makes them more human, because it shows that they are not unconditionally chaotic. We first learned of Dingo's uncertainty back in Upgrade, but Walkabout is designed to specifically examine how Dingo's uncertainty leads him to redeem himself. I said in, I think, my review of Shadows of the Past, that one advantage of the World Tour is that we get to focus on individual side characters, like Renard, Thalog, and now Dingo. And that's exactly what Walkabout does. It gives some nice development to someone who might otherwise just be a generic background character. One thing that made me fall in love with the show was the fact that pretty much every character is an individual person with a story of their own. Even side characters like Diane Maza or Preston Vogel have distinct personality traits and character developments. In the case of Dingo, he was initially just another part of the pack, but in episodes like Upgrade or Walkabout, he's been given a storyline specifically made for him. He does not share these character developments with the rest of the pack, and I think that makes the pack feel more like a group made up of individual people, rather than 5 people that comprise a non-specific character, if that makes sense. I think that by giving even the side characters in a story unique arcs of their own, it makes the world of the story more believable. Because that's the way the real world is. The people you pass by at school, or at the store, or while driving your car, all have histories of their own. They have names, and personalities, strengths, weaknesses, and identities, just like you do. So when you're designing an organization of characters in a story, write them with that principle in mind. I think it's a powerful but subtle way to get your audience immersed in the world of the story. I also thought that the episode effectively established the Matrix as a genuine threat. I don't necessarily mean its long-term impacts, but also its short-term capabilities. For example, there's a great escape scene in the middle of the episode where Anastasia and Fox are trying to escape the Matrix in a helicopter. The reason I love this scene is because of how genuinely tense it is. It actually feels like the Matrix could kill these two characters. It even forces Fox to make an emergency landing after it hits the helicopter. That's like a hint of what the Matrix could do to these people. And I also really like that Fox and Anastasia are visibly scared of the Matrix. The episode is showing that the characters are unsure of what's going to happen next, just like us. It's like the famous asteroid field scene from The Empire Strikes Back. The characters in that scene were scared of going into this asteroid field. And we got to see some of the TIE fighters tailing the Millennium Falcon get destroyed by these asteroids. The movie effectively set up that scene as something to be nervous about, and I think that's exactly what Walkabout does with the Matrix. The characters are genuinely frightened of the Matrix, and for good reason, and there are several intense action scenes in the episode that demonstrate its destructive capabilities. Next, I like the look of this episode. It looks like it was done by the same people that did City of Stone, meaning that you can expect expressive character models, detailed shading, soft outlines, and great scenery. It's a nice art style that I found easy to watch. I think that one of the most important goals of animators is to create animation that does not get in the way of the writing. I like the feeling of getting immersed in the world of the story, so if I see characters' faces shifting around unnaturally, or if the lighting is screwy, or if the lip sync does not match the audio, it takes me out of the movie, or the show. So that's why I said that I found Walkabout's art style easy to watch. The animation is consistently good, and the details, like the shadows on the screenshot on the right, bring the world to life. One quick but memorable moment in the episode happens when Goliath and Dingo are fighting the Matrix in the Dreamtime. I love that Goliath thought to bring in the trio and Hudson. It's a huge treat to see them again, even if these are just holograms created by Goliath. Plus it shows that Goliath has not forgotten about his friends back at home. It's a great little detail, and it was one of my favorite parts of the episode. As for criticisms, I thought that the ending of the episode was a little clumsy. So Goliath and Dingo are attacking the Matrix by introducing new elements into the program, which makes the Matrix grab Goliath and Dingo. Goliath starts explaining that order is dynamic and that it can change. And suddenly the Matrix is like, wow, cool, tell me more about this dynamic order. I feel like it's a bit awkward because the Matrix goes from forcefully resisting the idea of an evolving order to suddenly being intrigued by the concept. I feel like it goes from point A to point C without going through point B. Maybe the message is that Goliath was able to solve the problem when he used words rather than weapons, but that's not exactly a message that the episode had been building up to that point. So I do think that the turning point of this episode was a bit awkward. Overall, I had a lot of fun watching Walkabout. I love when shows give some screen time to the little guys, rather than just centralizing around a single character. So I like what they did with Dingo here. I thought that the Matrix was great because of how threatening it was, and I don't think you could really do that scenario in a New York episode. So I think that Walkabout is a solid world tour story overall. The next stop on the world tour is Nigeria, here in Mark of the Panther. This is where Goliath is finally going to recognize himself as Angela's one and only father. Thematically, this is a strong episode. One of the main concepts explored here is love, both familial and romantic. Diane effectively summarizes the episode's message by saying that if love is about growing closer, then it's also about letting go. You can see this concept manifested in the various plotlines running through this episode. First, Goliath insists on raising Angela like any other gargoyle hatchling, but he learns to let go of that tradition after Diane explains that it's natural for children to seek their parents' attention. Next, Elisa starts off the episode by trying to keep her personal life hidden from her mother. When asked about the gargoyles, Elisa quickly changes the subject. And when the group arrives at Kara DG, Elisa ensures that she's not paired up with Diane. But at the end of the episode, Elisa learns to let go of her own desires for secrecy, and she ends up being honest with her mother. And then there's Farah Maku, who learns that he should have let go of Taya rather than turn her into a panther out of his own selfishness. Lastly, if we want to stretch a little, you could say that Diane has to let go of Elisa so that the travelers can continue their quest around the world. I think that the messages here are conveyed well. You really get a clear idea of the theme due to the parallel plotlines running throughout the episode. The animation here is also pretty nice. The lighting is soft, but it effectively communicates the physical shapes of the characters. There are also some good details, such as Anansi's drool, or the intricate lines on the scope of Taya's gun, which you can see here. The scenes where Taya or Farah transform between human and panther also look great, but simply showing a screenshot would not do them justice, so you'll have to look for those the next time you watch the episode. Just like Walkabout, the animation here in Mark of the Panther is easy to watch. I'm not a big fan of the storytelling segment that Diane has at the start of the episode. It's kind of fun for the first minute or so, but I think it goes on a bit longer than it needs to. I understand that we need to be introduced to Anansi, Kara DG, and the Mark of the Panther itself, but I don't know if it is necessary to have this prolonged storytelling segment. Other legends that this show has explored, such as Ku Kalain and the Dreamtime, were incorporated in such a way that did not require lengthy storytime scenes. The closest comparison is probably the Rabbi Lo flashback from Golem. It was a much shorter scene, but it got the job done without feeling like it was delaying the rest of the plot. I think that another reason why I didn't like this storytelling segment very much is because it came at the very beginning of the episode. Given that Diane Maza is the one telling the story, I was more interested in finding out why she was here in Nigeria than I was in learning about the Panther Queen. The Rabbi Lo flashback that I just mentioned was placed in the middle of its episode, which meant that we had been given time to get oriented with the setting and the plot when that flashback came. By that point, we knew why Renard was in Prague, for example. Lastly, maybe not everyone will agree with me on this, but I think that Diane's storytelling takes away some of the surprise of the plot. Just after the story ends, Farah Maku turns into a panther, and we see that Taya has a mark on her shoulder. Because of this, I felt like I already knew much of what had happened between Farah and Taya, even though we had just finished the first act. From that point on, I found much of the episode's plot a bit predictable because of how obvious the Panther Queen story was foreshadowing it. Basically, I'm not a fan of Diane's storytelling sequence because I think it detracts from the episode more than it adds. I think it's a little too long, placed at not the best time, and it takes away some of the potential intrigue surrounding the remainder of the plot. Sort of continuing from the last point, I think that perhaps this episode's greatest problem is that it felt scripted to me. It feels a bit contrived to me that Diane just happened to be telling the story of the Panther Queen, when her friend Farah Maku is a living parallel of that story. It seemed too coincidental to feel unplanned. Plus, when the characters finally embark on their journey halfway into the episode, they explore the jungle for only a minute or two before coming across the gates of Kara DG. To me, it did not feel like we had gone very far, so it felt kind of weird that this ancient city was so close to civilization, yet was still a legend to the average person. It's like if you found Atlantis while going for a swim at the beach just outside the hotel you were staying at. See, what's great about television and film and stories in general is that they can make a sequence of scripted, planned events feel spontaneous and spur of the moment. And I feel like oftentimes, Mark of the Panther falls short of this. Several key events of the episode were too coincidental to not feel scripted to me. It felt like I was watching characters act out a script, which I think is a big no-no for any kind of story. So eventually the group comes across Anansi and a fight breaks out. It's actually a pretty good fight scene for the most part. Anansi is effectively strong and the battle develops efficiently. The fact that Anansi is able to take on 7 people at once, yet still be a step ahead of them, is a testament to his strength. I was curious to see how he could possibly be defeated given how tough he was. But the way the fight was resolved felt sudden and dissatisfying to me. So Taya turns into a panther and accidentally cuts the spiderwebs, and Anansi sort of wobbles a bit. Immediately after, Angela gets the idea to cut the webs because Anansi would be too fat to fight them on the ground. And as soon as she says this, the fight is pretty much won. Anansi is defeated 30 seconds later. I get that Angela is supposed to be a very perceptive character, but I don't think that should be used to justify poorly relieved tension. I forget where I heard this, but I watched some video once about how in stories, the way you relieve tension is just as important as the way you build tension. It's like breathing air. You've got to exhale the same amount of air that you inhale, otherwise it would cause a discrepancy. And I feel like that's what happens here in Mark of the Panther. You have this intense battle going on, but I feel like it's resolved too easily. If Anansi's weight had been established as his weakness earlier on, maybe during Diane's story for example, I could partially excuse the easy victory. But as the episode stands, I find the battle a bit dissatisfying in the end. Overall, I think that Mark of the Panther is a solid episode with some considerable problems. The theme was powerfully demonstrated through the many parallel plotlines running through the episode, but I thought that much of the plot felt scripted and artificial. I can't speak for everyone, but personally, that broke my suspension of disbelief. I think that there is a great story in here, but it needs to progress more naturally for me to find it believable. Pendragon is the first New York episode since Kingdom, which I covered all the way back in my previous video. This is the end of the longest drought without a New York episode in the entire series. Here we're going to learn about where King Arthur ended up after Avalon Part 3, and we're going to get to see the Manhattan Clan again. To start off, I like that this episode gives a little more focus to Macbeth's henchmen. We got a brief look at them back in Lighthouse, and they appeared in the background in Sanctuary, but aside from that, we haven't had much time to get to know them. Here in Pendragon, they get a bit more screen time, which I like. For starters, I'm glad that these guys are competent. There's a pretty good fight scene in the middle of the episode where the two henchmen beat up all the gargoyles. Here, they prove that they are not stupid, incapable grunts. Brooklyn gets thrown against a tree and Lex gets dumped off when he tries to hitch a ride. Broadway even gets shot at, but luckily he's able to defend himself just in time. These henchmen are smart and powerful. They're not going to stand around and let the good guys just beat them up. I feel like, oftentimes in action shows, the villains' henchmen are mere interruptions to the heroes, rather than being powerful threats of their own. So I'm glad that the henchmen in Pendragon are not bumbling idiots. Another cool part of the episode happens when Macbeth is learning of Arthur's plan to claim Excalibur, and one of the henchmen says something like, "You know, boss, you were a king once too." It's a great little line because it shows that Macbeth has a personal connection to his lackeys. He is willing to reveal his history to them. The henchmen are not just tools of war to him. Rather, they are smart and capable people that play an active role in this world. It's awesome. Next, this is also a pretty funny episode. I love the play on Brooklyn's name when the group is trying to decide where to go next. The reaction we get from Brooklyn is delivered perfectly. Then there's the part where Lex and Broadway find out that this beautiful girl has been living in the pond in their own backyard. And they're like, "Aw man, she was living in our lake all this time." And we also get one of those moments where Broadway tries to be a tough guy. He's sitting on this tree that's fallen down and he menacingly tells the henchman, "Now you stay put." And the guy's just nervously like, "Oh, no problem." I always love when Broadway of all people tries to be smug and cool, given how goofy he is. The episode has a nice level of humor, I think. I think it gives some good comic relief without getting in the way. One thing about Pendragon that I don't like is the portrayal of Macbeth. I felt he was kinda set up as a simple-minded, power-hungry villain. At the beginning of the episode, he's saying that something powerful is coming, and he wants it to come to him. And when Arthur and Griff fall out of the sky, Macbeth disappointingly says, "This is the prize?" I thought he sounded kind of entitled. And a bit further into the episode, he says that he wants whatever power Arthur is seeking for his own. He's not sure what power Arthur is after, but he wants it regardless. These power-hungry tendencies directly go against what I love about Macbeth's character. He's one of the show's major villains, but he's not exactly a villain. He has a sense of humility, and he displays genuine human emotion, like he did back at the end of Sanctuary. He seems like the kind of guy you could have a nice conversation over dinner with. He's a great character because he's understandable. I don't always agree with his actions, but I recognize why he behaves the way he does. Sanctuary ended with Macbeth lamenting that he was doomed to spend eternity alone. But sometime between that episode and Pendragon, he goes from being a broken human being to a villain who just wants power. I don't want to have dinner with the Macbeth of this episode. I felt like he was a completely different character here. Another complaint I have with this episode is that I don't think it does much for the Manhattan Clan. This is one of, like, 2 episodes in the World Tour that takes place entirely in New York. But I feel like Pendragon doesn't significantly develop any of the characters in the Manhattan Clan. So I was a little bummed that these guys don't really benefit from the episode. I can excuse Brooklyn, since he got excellent characterization back in Kingdom, but I feel like the others don't get anything new here. We simply see them doing things that we always saw them do in the past. Lexington's love of technology is demonstrated when he uses the jet bikes to creatively solve a problem. Broadway's fear of firearms is shown when he crumples up a gun. And Hudson swings his sword. These are fundamental abilities and character traits that we have been familiar with ever since the first season. I feel like these guys are pretty much the same at the end of the episode as they were at the beginning of the episode. So I was disappointed that Pendragon didn't try to give them new developments when it had the rare chance, because I think there's a lot of potential here. As I've quoted in my previous videos, I love the saying that a good way to develop characters is to take away what they have. The disappearance of Goliath and Elisa puts the rest of the Manhattan clan in a new and unfamiliar situation, because they can't rely on Goliath to lead the clan while he's gone. This is a scenario that I felt did wonders for Brooklyn and Kingdom. But we don't really get a chance to explore how the absence of Goliath and Elisa personally affects Lexington, Broadway, or Hudson. To be fair, I would not say that this episode is under any obligation to develop these characters here, but after seeing how much Kingdom did for Brooklyn, I couldn't help but feel like these guys got the short end of the stick, and that's a disappointment for me. I'm going to talk about this concept a bit more at the end of the video, so stick around until then. Don't jump ahead, but just know that we'll come back to this in a few minutes. I have a weird relationship with this episode. I actually really liked it the first time I watched it because it was so refreshing to see some of my favorite characters again after being away for so long. But I feel like when I've gone back to this episode on consecutive watches, that novelty is no longer enough to distract me from Macbeth's contrary characterization, or the Manhattan clan's lack of characterization. Lastly, as a side note, I noticed that I barely spoke about Griff and Arthur in this review, despite them being the episode's two leads. I don't feel strongly either way regarding them in this episode. It's interesting enough to see them work together, but for better or worse, they didn't really do anything that I reacted to strongly enough for me to want to go into detail on. I think they're just fine. And I don't feel the need to categorize their portrayals into I like it or I don't like it, if I don't feel strongly either way. But going back to what I was saying earlier, Pendragon is an interesting case. I think it's a decently serviceable romp through New York, but I would have liked for the episode to be more than it currently is. Next, we're going to head up to Norway in Eye of the Storm. This is going to be the last time we see the Eye of Odin. My favorite part of this episode was seeing Goliath as the antagonist. First of all, it's simply a shocking moment when he puts on the eye. Odin offers Goliath two choices. Either hand over the eye or say goodbye to Elisa. I guess I won't speak for everyone, but I was not expecting Goliath to take the third choice, put on the eye himself. That was always an option, but it's not something that I expected Goliath to use, so his choice surprised me in a good way. After he puts on the eye, the power starts going to his head. And he just looks really cool. Goliath starts off with good intentions. He creates snowstorms in order to move Elisa and the others to safety. But eventually, he starts treating his friends like mindless creatures that he gets to control. He's lying when he says that Odin is the one creating the storms. And Goliath doesn't just herd everyone into the cave, he imprisons them there. His new power is causing him to be dishonest and unjust, but he's not noticing it because of the eye. That's one of the main themes of the episode, I think. That having too much power can cause someone to be blinded to their own actions. And at the end of the day, Goliath only comes to his senses once his daughter's life is in peril. This might sound corny, but it's saying that no matter how much power you might have, the bond between a parent and a child can be even stronger. That's why I think this evil Goliath episode works better than the evil Elisa episode. The messages here are well established and communicated. Odin himself is another neat character. Before, he rarely had to deal with mortals personally because, well, he's a god. But ever since he lost his eye, he's been put into a relatively vulnerable position. He's still plenty powerful, but he can't just take the eye from Goliath. So Odin struggles to get what he wants because he simply doesn't know how. It's an interesting concept because the episode is demonstrating the result of relying too much on power. You don't know how much you rely on something until you lose it. I also like Eric and Gunther. They're two purely ordinary people, and that ironically makes them unique in comparison to other World Tour characters. Rory and Natsalani were introduced as normal guys, but in the end, Rory realized that he was actually an ancient hero, and Natsalani was sort of the chosen one since he was the only person that could stop Raven. Eric and Gunther have no similar hidden features. They also do not turn into panthers, or attempt to summon the god of death, or transport people to the Dreamtime. We haven't really had any simply mundane World Tour characters like Eric or Gunther yet, and that's what makes them special. It's fun to see how these two normal people are introduced to the Gargoyles and pulled into this battle against Odin and even Goliath. For example, after Goliath traps everyone in the cave, Eric calls Goliath a tyrant. It says that he's not protecting the group, he's imprisoning them. Eric is not familiar with Goliath, so he doesn't know what Goliath is actually like. Eric has good reason to dislike Goliath. It's similar to Derek back in Her Brother's Keeper. Derek had not seen the nasty things that Xanatos has done, but Elisa and the audience had. We knew that Derek was making a bad move, but Derek himself had little reason to distrust Xanatos. Similarly, Eric and Gunther have little reason to trust Goliath, because they have only been exposed to this villainous version of himself. Plus, they're not used to dealing with magical talismans, and gods, and gargoyles, and so forth. So it's difficult for them to get behind the idea of Goliath being controlled by a piece of jewelry. I think that Eric and Gunther are solid characters because their worldly background leads to some fun moments that you can't really get with a character who's familiar with the arcane. Given that this is the last time we see the Eye of Odin, I think the episode should have explained its backstory more. We know that the eye comes from Avalon, and that Odin is presumably from Avalon given that he's a child of Oberon, but we don't know how he became separated from his own eye. The episode unfortunately does not explain this, which is a shame because the eye's plotline is concluded with a major question being left unanswered. Now, according to the wiki, it turns out that Greg Weisman has revealed that the reason Odin lost his eye was because he traded it for a drink from Mimir's Pool of Wisdom. I guess it's nice to finally know the eye's backstory, but I think things like that should be explained within the show itself. Let's be real though, it's not like the show's collapsing because it does not give us a detailed account of the eye's history. Still, I would have liked to know a bit more about how Odin lost his eye, because it's the thing that's driving his actions throughout the episode. At the end of the day, I can't really think of any major complaints that I have with this episode. I view it the same way I view Hound of Ulster. It's simply a fun story that's successful at what it sets out to do. The new characters are effective, and it's a good episode to just kick back and relax with. Next is The New Olympians, which of course takes place in the fictional city of New Olympus. First of all, I was impressed with the character designs in this episode. A character's appearance should visually convey that character's personality and their role in the plot. You should be able to take a quick look at a character and be able to guess what they are like as a person. For instance, check out these pictures just as an exercise. You can take a quick look at these characters' appearances and instantly tell what that character is like, even if you had never watched the show before. Their visual designs speak for their personalities and their roles in the story. And this is something that I think The New Olympians excels at. Look at Boreas, for example. So first of all, he's tall and well-built. This visually implies that he's a person of great power. He resembles an old man with his white hair and his beard, which tells us that he is wise and experienced. He's also dressed in regal clothing, rather than battle armor, and he holds a scepter, indicating that this is a man who holds some degree of political authority over the other New Olympians. By simply looking at his character design, we are subconsciously told everything we need to know about him. Along the same lines, you can show a picture of Proteus to someone who has never seen this episode, and they will instantly understand Proteus's character. He's sneaky, cruel, and not to be trusted. I also like that some of the New Olympians, such as Chiron, Helios, and, again, Boreas, resemble ordinary humans to an extent. It's sort of visually saying that the New Olympians aren't that different from humans such as Elisa. It's ironic in a good way. And I think it's especially important for the character designs in a World Tour episode to go the extra mile, because the characters generally only get to be in a single episode. So next time you watch The New Olympians, or really any animated TV show or movie, pay close attention to the characters' visual designs. You might be surprised by how much a design can say about a particular character. One small but impactful moment comes when Taurus is escorting Elisa to her cell, and they pass by Proteus. Taurus says that Proteus is not like the other New Olympians, because he's evil. This is a neat moment because even though we've seen a lot of persecution and bigotry coming from the New Olympians, it's kind of nice to know that they don't see themselves as evil. Nobody thinks of themselves as the villain, and that idea is briefly reinforced through this line of dialogue. Here I can sort of bounce off of the last point and into this point. Now, if you've read other reviews of this episode, then my main complaint with it will probably not come as a surprise. So, one of the main themes of this episode is racism, but I don't think it's handled very well. I get that the New Olympians don't think of themselves as evil, but they still came across as simple-minded to me when they said things like, all humans are guilty, or I believe humans are dangerous. There's even a part after the travelers leave the Senate house, and they're just walking down the street. Then the New Olympians show up and start a fight. Like, the people in the city are too narrow-minded to be believable. I think the xenophobia message worked well in episodes like Awakening 1 and 2, for example, because not all of the humans were racist bigots. You had characters like the captain of the guards, or Tom, who were friendly to the Gargoyles. This was good because it made the world feel more like a believable place. Without getting too far into political territory, Hopefully we all understand that in the real world, racist attitudes do not represent the mindset of all people in a demographic. As a direct example, the beliefs of a white supremacist group obviously do not reflect the beliefs of all white people. The reason why the racism message worked in Awakening 1 and 2 was because it did not generalize. It showed that not all humans hated the Gargoyles, which gave the world of Gargoyles a degree of realism and credibility. However, in this episode, almost none of the new Olympians are sympathetic to Elisa, so it's hard to take it seriously. Even Boreas and Taurus show some signs of prejudice. I guess Talos is sort of the exception. Like, there's the part where he tells Boreas, hey, Elisa might be right. But he doesn't have much of a presence throughout most of the plot, unlike, say, the captain of the guards. The message in this episode came across as a bit forced to me because the new Olympians themselves were too insufferable to be believable. Another part that bothers me happens near the end of the second act, when Angela and Bronx turn to stone as the sun rises. When Chiron tied them up with those bola-type things, I was thinking, oh no, Angela and Bronx are in trouble. And that's good, because it's a situation that creates suspense. But it ended up feeling like a cheap trick to add tension because that plot point never comes into play again. The next time we see Angela and Bronx is at the end of the episode when the travelers are leaving the island on the skiff. Their subplot got resolved off-screen beforehand. In other words, it's an exciting setup, but the episode does not follow through with that setup. I think this is one of those episodes that's sort of fun because of its novelty, but it's held back by weak writing, sort of like Pendragon. I think the character designs are among the best in the world tour, but I also think that the episode's awkwardly handled message sadly holds it back. The next stop on the world tour is going to be Guatemala in the green. In this episode, we're going to meet another clan of Gargoyles and catch up with Vogel, who we last saw in Golem. Plus, Broadway and Lex make a special cameo appearance. So first of all, I forgot how good this episode looked. The movement and visual detail are incredible, especially in regards to the action scenes. Look at the screenshot on the right. It comes from the final battle of the episode, and it looks fantastic thanks to details such as the individual embers coming from the fire. I also really like the lighting on the characters here. Like with M.I.A., the lighting gives the characters a well-communicated sense of three-dimensional shape. Look at the precise shading on Lex in this screenshot, for example. The beautiful scenery also drew me into the world of the story, thanks to its intricate detail, as well as the episode's usage of panning shots and wide shots. The lip sync here is also really good too. You can even read the characters' lips at some points. Visually, I think this is a very strong episode. It ticks all of the boxes, and I would say that it's one of the best-looking episodes in the season. We also meet the Mayan clan here. In addition to their cool visual designs, I really like their complicated relationship with the humans. Centuries ago, the local humans lived in harmony with the Gargoyles, going as far as to create magical pendants that would allow the Gargoyles to stay awake during the day. But much like the Gargoyles in Scotland, a divide between the humans and the Gargoyles of Guatemala eventually appeared. A couple years ago, humans raided the pyramid, killing most of the Mayan Gargoyles in the process. Ever since then, the clan has sort of been at odds with the humans. You get a sharp reminder of this when Jade and Turquesa almost attack Elisa when they first see her. In addition, the Mayan Gargoyles are fighting with the humans that are tearing down all the trees in the forest. The humans don't think there's anything wrong with cutting down a few trees, but the Gargoyles know better. The clan's situation and backstory are effectively frustrating in a good way. I really sympathized with the Mayan clan after learning of their past and seeing the way they were treated by the local people. Another great element of this episode is Elisa. Here in the green, the fact that Elisa is a human and not a gargoyle leads to some neat moments. Much like the audience, Elisa sees both sides of the conflict at hand. After Zafiro scares some of the tree cutters away, Elisa contends that those people were just doing their job. They've got to work in order to make a living. But to the Mayan clan, that is understandably none of their concern. As Zafiro says, there is no such thing as a few trees. And later on in the episode, Elisa declines to get further involved in battling the poachers, because she refuses to violate the human-made laws of the land. You get a sense of how frustrating of a situation this is for Elisa, because she sees the issue from both sides. Elisa can't win either way. If she sides with the Gargoyles, she'd have to break her moral code. But if she sides with the humans, she'd have to be working against her friends. It sort of reminds me of how in The Cage, Elisa maintained that while Goliath had good intentions in tracking down Sevarius, she could not agree with his actions. Here in the green, we get to see that same code of honor again, and how Elisa's connection to the human world can cause complications for her. In the past, I've talked about how Goliath and the other gargoyles are fish out of water. They are strangers in a strange land, as Hudson would say. But even though Elisa is not a gargoyle, she is similarly a fish out of water, because she's just a normal human caught up in the world of gargoyles and sorcery. If you saw Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them last year, Elisa provides the same perspective that Jacob did in that movie. Elisa is the audience character, whose shoes we are supposed to put ourselves in. I love eye-opening culture clash moments such as the ones found in this episode, and it's fun to see Elisa be the odd one out. We also get some insight into Vogel's character here. I think this is the only episode in which Vogel makes an appearance, but Renard does not. Vogel does not get a ton of screen time here, but there is one particular line that precisely summarizes his character. When Jackal is explaining his devious plan to get rid of the gargoyles, Vogel says, "If you get the desired results, your methods are not my concern." He even notes that Renard would likely not have approved of such a plan, but that does not faze him. Vogel does not care about how you accomplish a task, so much as the task gets done in the first place. In a way, Vogel is the opposite of Elisa in this episode. Elisa refused to violate her code of honor, even if it meant protecting the forest. Vogel, on the other hand, says, "Screw honor, just do whatever it takes to get rid of the gargoyles." That's one of the themes explored by this episode. Do the ends justify the means? Should we all be celebrating the fact that the priceless sun amulet was in a reputable museum, when several gargoyles were killed during the amulet's retrieval? Is it okay to cut down quote-unquote a few trees if it means losing priceless healing plants in the process? This episode makes you think about how the steps you take to achieve a goal are just as important as the goal itself. I love how morally gray it all is. I think that's why Elisa is so relatable here. We, the audience, can see both sides of these issues, whereas most other humans in the story can only see one perspective. One thing that I thought this episode could have built up a bit more was its anti-deforestation argument. When Bronx gets cut by Hyena, we see how the Green's plants are able to quickly heal his wound. But I don't think there's much else in the episode that demonstrates the importance of protecting plant life. Obviously, the healing abilities of these flowers are remarkable, and they should be protected. But I would have liked for that point to have been showcased a bit more throughout the story. Without that one Bronx scene, we wouldn't have much reason to see the Green as anything special in comparison to other plants around the world. One thing that I don't get is why Hyena takes so long to shoot the amulet after Broadway and Lexington are knocked down. She spends like 15 or 20 seconds just staring at the amulet, giving the gargoyles plenty of time to catch up to her and throw a javelin at her arm. Hyena knows that Jackal is counting on her down in Guatemala, and she even notes that it will take just one little blast, so why not just zap the amulet and call it a night? Remember back in her brother's keeper how she wanted to steal the Coyote Diamond right then and there? Jackal stopped her on the grounds of style, but here in the museum, Jackal is not there to stop her. Every once in a while in this show, I feel like the villains are a little too generous to the heroes in regards to time. And I don't like that because it makes me feel like the villains are incompetent. It makes it feel like the heroes don't earn their victory so much as they are handed it. Now, this concept can be used well at times. At this point, I want to correct something that I said back in my Season 1 video. In my review of Long Way to Morning, I criticized Demona for whacking Hudson with the gun, when shooting him would be far more powerful. But in retrospect, I think the idea behind that scene was that Demona was so blinded by her rage and her pride that she was failing to think strategically, and that's the message. It's like when you play video games while in a bad mood, and as a result you just get destroyed at the game, because you aren't thinking clearly. But in regards to the Green, I don't think Hyena had much reason to take her time shooting the amulet. She says that it only takes one little blast, but knowing that the gargoyles were down but not out at that point, she should know that she can't take her time. Also, I think that the Broadway and Lexington subplot could have been resolved better. When they finally defeat Hyena, the two gargoyles pause and think about what Hyena was going to do with the amulet. And the scene ends with Broadway saying, "We should probably destroy it." But the next time we see him and Lex, it's shown that he eventually decided not to destroy the amulet. We don't know why they changed their minds. I should point out that the two gargoyles saw that Hyena was planning to shoot the amulet, so that's probably why they decided to hold onto it rather than break it. But that makes the "we should probably destroy it" line feel like a cheap attempt to add in some uncalled for suspense. Another eyebrow-raising moment happens when Obsidiana's pendant somehow unties itself and gets wrapped around a tree branch, which you can see in this picture. We see her reach around the tree in order to get rid of some brush fire, but I'm not sure how the pendant would have gotten tied around that branch. Like, the pendant is around her neck, right? Wouldn't Obsidiana be caught on the branch as well when she moves away from the tree? Like, how is this physically possible? Despite a few instances of questionable logic and frivolous attempts at generating suspense, I think that The Green is a good episode. The animation looks incredible. and I was surprised by how well this 20-minute long episode handled such a large cast of characters. I hold it in the same regard as, say, The Silver Falcon, in that I would not say that this is one of the most tightly written episodes in the series, but it's still a ton of fun, and it has lots of strong points. I'm going to end this video with my review of Sentinel, which takes place on Easter Island. This episode has got some good laughs in it. A lot of the comedy comes from Elisa's memory loss. Her initial interactions with Goliath are hilarious because of how overwhelmed she is. Elisa kicks Goliath in the chest, which he completely shrugs off. Their subsequent banter as they go around the island leads to some great moments as well, such as the King Arthur and the Holy Grail joke. And I love hearing Keith David say in his epic, deep voice, "My name is not Tiny." I thought that was a funny bit of humor that could only work in a situation like this. The humor here works because the scenario naturally gives rise to unexpected and comedic moments. It's kind of like The Mirror, back at the start of the season. That episode used its premise to fuel the comedy, and that's what Sentinel does as well. I also like the scene at the very beginning of the episode with Goliath and Angela wandering around Easter Island. They have no idea what the M.I.A statues are, or even what island they are currently on, but we, the audience, do. I love fish-out-of-water characters because they let you see a familiar world in a new way. It's a fun little moment. It gives us a bit of that same perspective that we got back in Awakening when the Gargoyles were not sure what to think of this new world that they had found themselves in. I always find the battle scenes in the third act a little hard to get through. I think they're a bit on the repetitive side. So, about 15 minutes into the episode, this giant electric snake thing is introduced. This makes Elisa decide to free the Gargoyles, and for the next couple of minutes, the fight is basically a series of individual elements that get repeated several times. Goliath jumps on the snake's back, which causes it to start shooting lasers everywhere, which starts damaging the ship. Bronx jumps on top of Nokar, who is pressing buttons on the ship's control panel. Eventually, Goliath gets thrown off, but then Angela takes his place, and the same things happen. The snake recoils and starts firing lasers everywhere again, which again damages the ship. But then Angela's knocked off, just like Goliath was. So Nokar goes back to the control panel again and starts pressing buttons again. Goliath jumps on the snake again, which causes it to shoot more lasers, further damaging the ship again. Finally, Goliath manages to take down the snake, and Bronx knocks down Nokar yet again, and the ship continues to be destroyed. There's a lot of repetition. I think the fight becomes stale as time goes on. And after Elisa, Angela, and Bronx escape, Nokar gets back up again, but then we see him and Goliath punch and punch and punch and punch and punch each other for a while, before Goliath knocks down Nokar yet again. Goliath escapes, but Nokar comes back yet another time, and the spaceship emerges from the ground, in surprisingly good condition, I might add. The stuff that plays out in the following encounter is nice, but I found getting there to be a chore because of all the repetitive beats throughout the fights. Eventually, it's revealed that Elisa's true memories and true feelings will naturally be restored over a few hours. But in that case, why did Nokar not just imprison the Gargoyles as well as Elisa for a few hours? That way, time could tell whether Elisa's instincts are true, and consequentially, if the Gargoyles can be trusted or not. Or Nokar could at least not have left that laser gun in a place where Elisa could easily pick it up and release the Gargoyles. That's actually pretty much all I've got to say about Sentinel. I have dreaded reviewing this episode for a while because I'm still not sure how I feel about it, even though I've seen it a couple of times. There are some fun moments, particularly early on, but I don't like the action scenes that come in the third act. I can't say how I feel about most of the stuff that happens in between the beginning and the end. The episode is just so weird that I'm not sure how to react to it. I wonder if I would have been more engaged in the episode had it come earlier on in the World Tour. I remember not being worried for Elisa's memory when I watched this episode for the first time, because by the time I got to it, I had grown accustomed to the structure of the World Tour. I just assumed that that subplot was going to be resolved before the next episode, so I was not very worried about the outcome. So I'm not really sure how I feel about Sentinel overall. To me, it's just kind of there. Closing thoughts this time are going to be a little different and probably a bit longer, so bear with me here. Even though at this point we are not done with the World Tour, we are certainly pretty close, so I figured I might as well talk about the World Tour as a whole at the end of this video, rather than waiting until the next one. For the most part, I thought that the World Tour effectively expanded the world of the show. Episodes like Mark of the Panther or Walkabout focus on existing characters in such a way that would not be possible in a New York episode. Shadows of the Past even managed to bring back 2 dead characters in a way that felt believable because it took place in Scotland. Seeing the various gargoyle clans around the world is also a highlight. you can compare them to the Manhattan Clan and imagine what other clans are like around the globe. By simply giving us a small taste of what gargoyles are like in just a few other nations, you get a sense of how diverse gargoyles really are, because it lets you fill in the blanks in your mind. Angela is also a great addition to the series. I love the new dynamic that she brings to Goliath's character, and it's fun to see her reactions to all the places she visits. She's lived on Avalon her whole life, so concepts such as the Sphinx or the Golem are completely foreign to her. As Xanatos might say, her naivete is refreshing. Basically, I think the World Tour generally benefits the series, because it expands upon specific pre-existing elements, such as individual characters, plotlines, and objects. Next, this is the part that I was hinting at back in my review of Pendragon. To start off, one of my hobbies for the past 2 years or so has been reading and watching movie reviews online. So once I got into this TV show, I also started reading Gargoyles episode reviews, and that's partially what inspired me to write my own. There's a lot of blogs and journals online where people review each individual episode of Gargoyles. Now, based on what I've seen from reading reviews from several different sources, I've noticed that the World Tour seems to be a bit of a polarizing topic among the show's fan base. I've seen some reviewers say it's one of their favorite parts of the series, whereas other reviewers have said that they found it gimmicky or even boring. Personally, the first time I watched the show, I honestly struggled to get through the World Tour. I made it to, grief before I said, okay, how long is this going to go on for? So this sort of divide among the fan base has been something that I've wondered about a lot. What is it that makes the World Tour so polarizing? Why was it some people's favorite story arc, while others don't care for it as much? By thinking about this, I've learned something that I thought was pretty cool. I started off by thinking about why it was difficult for me to get through the World Tour my first time around. I think it's because I really wanted to see the characters that were back at home, such as Broadway, Lexington, Brooklyn, Hudson, Xanatos, and even M.I.A. Don't get me wrong, I love Goliath, Elisa, Angela, and Bronx. I think they're all excellent characters. But during the World Tour, the show primarily focuses on just those 4 characters, and as a result, a lot of the other regular characters, like the other gargoyles in the Manhattan Clan, get left in the dust. Now, that was a big detriment for me. During the World Tour, a lot of the show's regular characters have to take the back seat. But here's the important point that I've been meaning to get to. The reasons why I struggled to get through the World Tour the first time around might not even apply to someone else, and for completely justifiable reasons. To put it simply, I think it comes down to what sort of stories work best for you. Personally, I enjoy stories like The Lord of the Rings, which juggles multiple character plotlines at a time. I like focusing on character A for a bit, and then character B, and then character C, and then maybe we bounce back to character B again, and then we check in with character A, and so forth. That sort of back and forth storytelling really resonates with me personally. I think one reason why I got hooked on Gargoyles was because the show gives each character their own episodes to star in. Silver Falcon is an episode for Broadway. The Press is an episode for Hudson. I liked that the focus bounced from character to character. But that same structure might not resonate as strongly with other people. Other people may prefer stories that concentrate on a smaller collection of characters that are together throughout the whole plot. Someone with that sort of preference would probably like the World Tour more than I initially did, because the primary focus is on a concentrated pool of 4 characters, with the occasional cameo appearance from Brooklyn, Lexington, and Broadway. And that's the thing. Everyone has different backgrounds, personalities, and learning styles that they bring to the table, and I think that's why everyone reacts to art differently. The type of storytelling structure that works best for me might not work as well for you, and vice versa. Another simple theory as to why the World Tour is rather polarizing may have to do with the genres it focuses on. This series draws from several genres such as action, drama, superhero, adventure, and fantasy. During the World Tour, there's more of an emphasis on magic and mythology, so I think someone who values the fantasy and adventure aspects in particular might enjoy the World Tour more than someone who prefers the superhero side of the story, for instance. The World Tour has a sort of Percy Jackson or Indiana Jones vibe, whereas the series before that point had elements of Batman and X-Men. Your personal tastes in fiction are going to influence what side of the show you prefer. I currently enjoy the World Tour considerably more than I used to. I know what happens to all the characters in the end, so now I can better focus on the World Tour episodes themselves rather than wonder what's going on back in New York. The reason I liked Pendragon the first time I watched it was because I got to see my favorite characters again after being away for so long. The show was momentarily giving me that Lord of the Rings type character focus that I was so hungry for. Even though it currently bothers me that those characters don't particularly get much out of that episode, the first time around, that was not a problem for me, because my desire to simply see them again was fulfilled. The basic point I'm trying to get across here is that I've learned that if someone likes something that I don't like, or vice versa, it's not that they have bad taste. Rather, it's because they simply have different tastes. As I've said before, I read and watch a lot of movie reviews online as a hobby. I remember when Jeremy Johns posted his review of Dunkirk, or when Chris Stuckman posted his review of Rogue One. There were some pretty hostile comments on those videos, because the reviews offered rather contrary opinions. To be fair, there were many commenters who said things like, "Okay, I don't agree with the reviewer's opinion, but I respect it regardless." Still, I remember being shocked by how maliciously dogmatic several commenters were because a reviewer said something that did not align with their own tastes. I think that saying that a particular movie or TV show can only be seen in a single way goes against the point of art in the first place. Art is subjective. One size does not fit all. I think the point of art is that everyone interprets it their own way. That's something that I've come to understand by making these reviews. The World Tour is still not my favorite part of the show, but I now understand why it could be for someone else. Learning about how art is not one size fits all has helped me better understand where people are coming from in online discussions of film and TV. It's something that has helped me out a lot. So that's about it for this video. Next is the fourth and final part of the season, which includes some very important episodes such as The Gathering and, of course, Hunter's Moon. Currently, I have next to no material written for part 4, so who knows how long it'll take to finish that video. But, as always, thank you for watching. I hope you feel it was worth your time, and I hope you look forward to the next video, and I'll see you guys then.